The frozen ground of the Ardennes forest trembled beneath the weight of 1,000 German tanks as dawn broke on December 16, 1944. Sergeant William Buck Morrison of the 106th Infantry Division pulled his wool collar tighter against the bitter wind, unaware that he was about to witness Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble to turn the tide of world. The Ardennes was considered so peaceful that Green troops were sent there to gain experience without facing serious combat. The dense forests and rolling hills of Belgium and Luxembourg seemed an unlikely place for major military action. German prisoners had been surrendering in droves for months, and scuttlebutt around the camp suggested the war would be over by Christmas. But at 5:30 that morning, the earth itself seemed to explode. Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's audacious counteroffensive, erupted across an 85-mile front with the fury of a winter storm. 3 German armies, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, the 6th Panzer Army commanded by Joseph Sepp Dietrich, and the 7th Army led by General Erich Brandenberger, crashed through the American lines like a steel avalanche. The plan was breathtakingly ambitious. Punch through the Allied front, race northwest to capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split the British and American forces in two. Hitler believed this bold stroke would force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviet Union in the east. Morrison's position near the village of Sankt Vith bore the brunt of Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. The pre-dawn artillery barrage was unlike anything the young sergeant had experienced, a continuous thunder that seemed to shake loose his very soul. Massive railway guns hidden deep in the German positions hurled shells the size of automobiles into American foxholes and command posts, as referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive study, Citizen Soldiers. The initial German assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American forces spread thin across what was considered a dormant front, found themselves overwhelmed by an enemy they thought was nearly defeated. Through the smoke and chaos, Morrison could see the distinctive silhouettes of German Tiger tanks, emerging from the tree line like prehistoric beasts. Their massive guns spoke with voices of thunder, turning American Sherman tanks into funeral pyres that lit the winter sky with orange flame. Behind the armor came the gray-uniformed infantry of the Volksgrenadier divisions, moving with the desperate energy of men who knew this was their last chance. The 106th Infantry Division, composed largely of replacement troops who had never seen serious combat, began to crumble under the onslaught. Entire companies simply vanished in the first hours of fighting, their radio frequencies falling silent one by one. Communication lines were severed, supply routes cut, and command structure shattered. Morrison watched in horror as his company, Commander Captain James Mackenzie, tried desperately to establish contact with battalion headquarters. The radio crackled with static and confused voices, reports of German breakthroughs everywhere, requests for reinforcements that couldn't be spared, and the increasingly frantic calls of units being overrun by noon. It became clear that this was no local German probe or spoiling attack. This was a full-scale offensive, launched with a fury that spoke of Hitler's absolute determination to change the course of the war. The Battle of the Bulge, so named for the dangerous salient the Germans would drive into Allied lines, had begun in earnest. The second day of the German offensive dawned gray and bitter, with fog so thick that Morrison could barely see 10 yards in any direction. The weather, which had initially favored the German attack by grounding Allied aircraft, now created a nightmarish landscape where friend and foe moved like ghosts through the mist. Lieutenant Colonel Hurley Fuller of the 110th Infantry Regiment found himself commanding a defense that existed more on paper than in reality. His positions around the town of Klurth had been shattered by German panzer columns, and scattered groups of American soldiers wandered through the fog-shrouded forests, trying to find their units or simply survive. The German advance had been so swift and overwhelming that entire battalions had been bypassed, creating pockets of resistance behind enemy lines. Some of these isolated groups would hold out for days, tying down German resources and disrupting their carefully planned timetables. Others were quickly overwhelmed, their survivors streaming westward with tales of an unstoppable German juggernaut. Fuller's radio operator, Private Danny Martinez from El Paso, managed to raise division headquarters long enough to report their desperate situation. "Sir, we've got German armor moving through Clerf and company strength," he transmitted, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We're holding the high ground east of town, but we're running low on ammunition and anti-tank rounds." The response crackled back through static. "Hold your positions at all costs. Reinforcements are en route." But both men knew that reinforcements were a luxury the rapidly collapsing front couldn't afford. Every available unit was either already committed to the fight or racing to plug gaps in the line, the strategic reserve that might have contained. The German breakthrough simply didn't exist. Allied commanders had been so confident of imminent victory that they had stripped the Ardennes of experienced troops for operations elsewhere, as documented in Hugh Cole's official army history. The Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge. The initial German success stemmed not just from tactical surprise, but from a fundamental misreading of enemy intentions by Allied intelligence. The fog began to lift around midday, revealing a landscape transformed by war. The peaceful villages of the Ardennes had become battlefields, their stone houses pockmarked by shell fragments and machine gun fire. Church steeples, once symbols of divine protection, now served as observation posts for artillery spotters. The winding country roads were clogged with burning vehicles, American supply trucks caught by German advance elements, and the occasional German half-track destroyed by determined G's with bazookas. Fuller watched through his binoculars as German Mark IV Panzer tanks rolled through Clerf's main street, their commanders standing brazenly in open turrets. These weren't the desperate, half-trained Volksgrenadier troops they had expected to face in a last-ditch German defense. These were veteran panzer crews, their equipment well-maintained and their tactics sharp. Behind the armor came the infantry, moving with the confidence of soldiers who sensed victory within their grasp. Some wore the distinctive camouflage smocks of elite Waffen-SS units, while others sported the field gray uniforms of regular Wehrmacht divisions. What united them was a sense of purpose that had been absent from German forces for months. Private Morrison, now separated from his original unit, had joined Fuller's improvised defense force. He crouched in a foxhole beside Corporal Jake Thompson, veteran of the Normandy landings, who had seen enough combat to recognize when a situation was truly desperate. "This ain't like anything we faced in France," Thompson muttered, checking his M1 Garand rifle for the 10th time. "Jerry's got his tail up now. It's fighting like he believes he can still win this thing." Through the afternoon, German probing attacks tested the American perimeter. Small groups of infantry would advance under cover of mortar fire, seeking weak points in the hastily organized defense. Each attack was beaten back, but at a cost the Americans could ill afford. Ammunition was running low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and the cold was taking its toll on men who had been fighting without rest for 36 hours. As darkness fell on the second day of the offensive, Fuller realized that his position was no longer tenable. German forces had bypassed Clerf to the north and south, making his stand increasingly isolated. The decision to withdraw was agonizing. Every mile of ground given up brought the Germans closer to their objectives. But continuing to hold would simply result in the destruction of his remaining men. By December 18th, the German offensive had achieved a penetration of nearly 20 miles in some sectors, creating a dangerous bulge in the Allied lines that threatened to split American forces in two. But amid the chaos and retreat, individual acts of heroism began to emerge, small unit actions that would slow the German advance and buy precious time for Allied commanders to organize a coherent response. Technical Sergeant Netchicks of the 2nd Armored Division had been awakened at 0300 hours by the thunder of German artillery. His Sherman tank, nicknamed Fury's Daughter by its crew, was part of a hastily assembled task force racing east to blunt the German spearheads. The roads were clogged with retreating American units, supply trucks, ambulances, and the occasional tank or half-track that had escaped the initial onslaught. "Jesus, Sarge," muttered Private First Class Bobby Reynolds, the tank's loader, as they passed a column of walking wounded. "Look at those guys. They look like they've been through hell." Hendricks nodded grimly. The retreating soldiers bore the hollow-eyed look of men who had faced something beyond their experience. Many had lost their weapons, their equipment, sometimes even their units. They walked westward in small groups, following roads that led away from the sound of German guns. The task force, 2 companies of Sherman tanks, a company of tank destroyers, and a battalion of armored infantry represented one of the few cohesive units available to contest the German advance. Their mission was simple: advance to contact, engage the enemy, and hold as long as possible. Colonel Morris Rose, commanding the task force, understood that they were buying time with blood. Each hour they delayed, the German advance was an hour. For Allied reinforcements to arrive, for supply lines to be secured, and for the scattered American forces to reorganize. His men would pay the price. But the alternative, a complete German breakthrough to the Meuse River, was unthinkable. The first contact came near the village of Trois Ponts, where German paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Army had seized a crucial bridge. These weren't ordinary infantry. They were elite troops commanded by Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt, veterans of Crete and Normandy who had been dropped behind American lines to secure key crossroads and create maximum confusion, as detailed in Charles MacDonald's authoritative account, A Time for Trumpets. These small unit actions across the Ardennes would prove crucial in disrupting German timetables and preventing a complete breakthrough. Hendrix's tank crested a small hill overlooking Trois Ponts, just as the German paratroopers were setting up defensive positions around the bridge. Through his periscope, he could see gray uniformed figures digging in among the stone houses of the village, their movements sharp and professional. "Target, infantry in the open, 11 o'clock, he called. To his gunner, Sergeant Mike O'Brien. "Identified," O'Brien replied, traversing the 75mm gun toward the German positions. The engagement that followed was brief but vicious. Hendrix's tank fired high-explosive shells into the German positions, while the armored infantry deployed from their half-tracks to assault the village on foot. The German paratroopers fought with the desperation of elite troops who knew they were vastly outnumbered. But their light weapons were no match for American armor. Within an hour, Trois Ponts was back in American hands, but the cost had been significant. 2 Sherman tanks burned beside the bridge, their crews either dead or severely wounded. The armored infantry company had lost nearly a third of its strength, clearing the village house by house. More importantly, the brief engagement had consumed precious time and ammunition. Each small victory was won at a price the Americans could barely afford, while the Germans continued to pour fresh units into the battle from their strategic reserves. As night fell on the 3rd day of the offensive, Hendrix found himself commanding a defensive position on the west bank of the Amblève River. His original crew was gone, Reynolds killed by a German Panzerfaust rocket, O'Brien evacuated with severe burns from their tank's destruction that afternoon. The replacement crew was green, composed of mechanics and re-echelon troops pressed into service as the situation became increasingly desperate. Through the darkness, he could hear the rumble of German armor moving up for another assault. Tomorrow would bring fresh attacks, new challenges, and more heroic stands by isolated groups of American soldiers. The Battle of the Bulge was far from over, but the initial German momentum was beginning to slow as American resistance stiffened. Throughout the Honnête, December 20th dawned cold and clear over the strategic crossroads town of Bastogne, where Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and his 101st Airborne Division found themselves completely surrounded by German forces. The paratroopers rushed to the Ardennes from their rest positions in France, had arrived just in time to prevent the Germans from capturing this crucial road junction. McAuliffe stood in the basement of the Heinz barracks, studying a map that showed German positions on all sides of the town. Red arrows marked enemy attacks from the north, south, east, and west, a complete encirclement that would have broken the morale of lesser units. But the 101st Airborne had earned their reputation as elite troops through campaigns in Normandy and Operation Market Garden, and they were not easily intimidated. "Sir, we've got German armor probing our perimeter again," reported Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. "It looks like they're testing for weak spots before launching a major assault." Da 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 da. German forces surrounding Bastogne represented some of the finest units in the Wehrmacht. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, reinforced by elements of the Panzerlehr Division, had been given explicit orders to capture the town quickly and continue the advance westward. But the unexpected arrival of American paratroopers had turned what should have been a simple occupation into a grinding siege. Lieutenant Dick Winters, of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, crouched in a foxhole on the northern perimeter of the town. His men had been fighting continuously for 4 days. Living on rations and ammunition, they had scrounged from abandoned American positions. The cold was bitter, temperatures had dropped to near 0 Fahrenheit, and many of his soldiers were suffering from frostbite and trench foot. "Lieutenant, we've got movement in the tree line," whispered Sergeant Donald Malarkey, pointing toward a cluster of pine trees about 200 yards away. "Looks like Jerry's forming up for another attack." Winters nodded, checking his Thompson. Submachine gun one more time. The German attacks had followed a predictable pattern: artillery bombardment followed by infantry assault. With occasional tank support, each attack was beaten back, but at a cost in ammunition and casualties that the surrounded Americans could ill afford. According to John Toland's definitive study battle, The Story of the Bulge, the siege of Bastogne became a symbol of American determination and would prove to be a crucial turning point in the German offensive. The sound of German mortar began to echo across the frozen landscape, followed by the distinctive whistle of incoming shells. Winters pressed himself against the bottom of his foxhole as explosions erupted around the perimeter. Clods of frozen earth rained down on his helmet, and he could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire as German infantry began their advance. "Here they come," shouted Corporal Floyd Talbert from a position 30 yards to the left. At least 2 companies moving through the woods. The German assault was led by veteran Panzergrenadiers of the Panzerlehr Division, experienced troops who moved with tactical precision through the dense forest. They advanced in small groups, using the natural cover of trees and fallen logs to approach the American positions. Behind them came the gray-clad soldiers of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Winters opened fire with his Thompson, the weapon's distinctive chatter mixing with the crack of M1 Garand's and the heavier sound of Browning automatic rifles. The German attack faltered as it met determined American resistance, but the enemy infantry continued to advance. Stepping over their fallen comrades with grim determination, the battle for Bastogne's perimeter raged for 3 hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. German attackers would overrun an American position, only to be driven back by counterattack. American paratroopers would advance to exploit a gap in German lines, only to be forced back by enemy reserves. By mid-afternoon, the German assault had been repelled, but at a terrible cost. Easy Company had lost 8 men killed and 15 wounded casualties they could not replace. Ammunition was running critically low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and the men were beginning to show signs of combat fatigue. That evening, German officers approached the American lines under a flag of truce. They carried an ultimatum from General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps: surrender honorably or face annihilation by overwhelming force. McAuliffe's response would become legendary in American military history. After considering the German demand for several minutes, he scribbled a single word on a piece of paper: nuts. December 23rd brought the first clear skies the Ardennes had seen since the German offensive began. And with it came salvation. From above, the thick clouds and fog that had grounded Allied aircraft for a week finally lifted, revealing a winter landscape transformed by war but bathed in brilliant sunshine. Major Richard Bong, the top American fighter ace of World War II, led a squadron of PFT-1 Mustangs on the first major air mission over the battlefield since the German attack began. From his cockpit at 15,000 feet, he could see the entire scope of the battle spread out below, burning vehicles marking the paths of German advances, smoke rising from contested villages, and the distinctive contrails of hundreds of Allied aircraft converging on the battlefield. Eagle leader to all Eagle flights. Bong radioed to his squadron. We've got targets of opportunity all across the grid. Jerry's been moving in the open for a week, and now it's payback time. The effect of Allied air power on the German offensive was immediate and devastating. Luftwaffe fighters, weakened by months of attrition and fuel shortages, could offer only token resistance to the massive aerial armada that descended on the Ardennes. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs strafed German columns, while medium bombers struck bridges, supply depots, and troop concentrations. Captain Charles Carpenter, flying a modified L for observation aircraft equipped with bazookas, became known as the Bazooka Charlie for his attacks on German armor. Despite flying one of the most vulnerable aircraft in the American inventory, Carpenter and other artillery spotters provided crucial intelligence on German movements and directed devastating artillery strikes on enemy positions. On the ground, the weather change meant that supply drops could finally reach the besieged garrison at Bastogne. C-47 transport aircraft, flying at minimum altitude to avoid German anti-aircraft fire, began dropping desperately needed ammunition, medical supplies, and food to McAuliffe's paratroopers. Staff Sergeant Jake McNeil of the 400 and 36th Troop Carrier Group piloted one of the first supply missions to Bastogne. His twin-engine transport, heavily laden with ammunition boxes and medical supplies, approached the drop zone at barely 500 feet altitude, while German anti-aircraft guns tracked his every move. 2 minutes to drop zone, called his co-pilot, Lieutenant Bob Harrison. I can see the signal panels now. They're right where they're supposed to be. The drop zone was a small field on the western edge of Bastogne, marked by orange panels arranged in a pre-arranged pattern. German forces controlled the surrounding area, but American paratroopers held the field itself in a precarious salient that extended from the main defensive perimeter. As recorded in the official Army Air Forces history, the Army Air Forces in World War II, these supply missions were among the most dangerous flown during the entire war. With transport crews facing both enemy fire and treacherous weather conditions, McNeil's aircraft shuddered as German 20mm anti-aircraft shells burst nearby, filling the air with deadly fragments. Through his windscreen, he could see muzzle flashes from German positions in the surrounding woods, and tracer rounds streaked past his cockpit like deadly fireflies. 30 seconds, Harrison called out, his hand on the release lever for the supply bundles. The C-47 swept low over the drop zone, its cargo of ammunition and medical supplies tumbling earthward beneath white parachutes. On the ground, American paratroopers rushed from their foxholes to retrieve the precious bundles, keen frantically to collect supplies before German artillery could zero in on their position. Meanwhile, the broader air campaign was having a profound effect on German operations throughout the Ardennes. Road columns that had moved freely under cover of clouds now found themselves under constant attack from Allied fighter bombers. The German advance, which had maintained its momentum for nearly a week, began to slow as fuel shortages and supply problems mounted. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, watched helplessly as his armored spearheads ground to a halt for lack of gasoline. The elaborate German supply system, which had worked adequately under cloudy skies, collapsed under the weight of continuous air attack. Fuel trucks were destroyed faster than they could be replaced, and ammunition convoys were forced to travel. Only at night, the psychological effect on German troops was equally significant. Soldiers who had advanced confidently for a week, under protective cloud cover, now found themselves exposed to devastating attacks from an enemy they could barely see. The Luftwaffe, which had promised air support for the offensive, was virtually absent from the skies over the Ardennes. By evening on December 23rd, it was clear that the German offensive had reached its high-water mark. The weather break had fundamentally altered the balance of forces in the Ardennes, giving the Allies an advantage they would never relinquish. The sound of tank tracks on frozen ground announced the arrival of salvation for the besieged garrison of Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, had driven his Sherman tanks through 70 miles of German-held territory in less than 48 hours, a feat of tactical mobility that would become legendary in American military annals. General George Smith Patton, Jr. had received his orders on December 19th, disengaged the Third Army from its offensive operations in the Saar Basin, wheel 90 degrees, to the north and attack the southern flank of the German penetration. It was a maneuver of breathtaking complexity requiring the movement of over 200,000 men and their equipment across icy roads while maintaining operational security, Gentleman Patton had told his corps commanders at their emergency conference. The crowd has stuck his head in a meat grinder, and I'm going to turn the handle. The Third Army's pivot northward represented one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the entire war. In less than 72 hours, 3 entire divisions, the 4th and 6th Armored Divisions and the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions had disengaged from active combat operations, moved over 100 miles through winter weather and launched coordinated attacks against German positions in the Ardennes. Abrams' lead tank Thunderbolt 4th crested the final hill overlooking Bastogne at 1450 hours on December 26th. Through his periscope, he could see the smoke rising from the besieged town and the distinctive white parachutes of supply drops scattered across the landscape. More importantly, he could see American soldiers emerging from their foxholes too. Wave at his approaching tanks. Bastogne Base, this is Thunderbolt 4. Abrams radioed to McAuliffe's headquarters. We're coming through the wire now. The cavalry has arrived. The relief of Bastogne marked a crucial turning point in the Battle of the Bulge, but it was only the beginning of the Allied counterattack. Patton's Third Army struck the German southern flank with devastating effect, while Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group prepared to attack from the north. The German salient, which had seemed so threatening a week earlier, was now becoming a trap for Hitler's best remaining divisions. Major General Matthew Ridgway's 18th Airborne Corps rushed to the Ardennes from strategic reserve, took positions. Along the northern shoulder of the German penetration, the 82nd Airborne Division, commanded by Brigadier General James Gavin, established defensive positions near the town of Werbemont, blocking any German attempt to expand the breakthrough northward. Staff Sergeant Morris Cohen of the 104th Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself fighting in terrain, not like anything he had experienced in previous campaigns. The dense forests of the Ardennes, covered with snow and swept by bitter winds, created a battlefield where visibility was measured in yards rather than miles, and small unit actions determined the outcome of larger engagements, as documented. In Robert Merriam's classic study Dark December, the Allied response to the German offensive demonstrated both the resilience of democratic armies and the advantages of superior logistics and air power. Cohen, take your squad and establish contact with Fox Company, ordered Captain William Tucker, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. They should be holding positions about 500 yards to our north, but we lost radio contact too. Hours ago. Cohen nodded, checking his M1 Garand rifle and adjusting the straps of his heavy pack. His squad, reduced to 6 men by casualties and illness, represented a tiny fraction of the massive forces now converging on the Ardennes. But in the confused fighting of the forest, small units often determined the fate of entire operations. Patrol moved carefully through the snow-covered underbrush, each man alert for signs of German presence. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the occasional crack of a distant rifle shot or the rumble of artillery to break the silence. Tree branches, heavy with snow, created natural camouflage, but also limited visibility to a few dozen yards in any direction. After 30 minutes of careful movement, Cohen's point man, Private Jimmy Kowalski, from Detroit, suddenly held up his hand in the signal for enemy in sight. Through the trees ahead, they could see the distinctive field gray uniforms of German soldiers moving in single file along a forest path. The engagement that followed was typical of hundreds of similar actions throughout the Ardennes. A brief, vicious firefight between small groups of infantry, followed by tactical movement and renewed contact. Neither side could claim decisive victory, but each engagement wore down German strength and delayed their operations. By nightfall on December 26th, it was clear that the German offensive had not only been stopped, but was beginning to reverse. The relief of Bastogne had eliminated the most serious German penetration. While attacks by the 3rd Army and 18th Airborne Corps were beginning to reduce the size of the salient, Hitler's last gamble in the West was failing. To both sides had been enormous. January 28, 1945, marked the official end of the Battle of the Bulge as American forces restored the original front lines that had existed before the German offensive began. The final German withdrawal from the Ardennes salient came not as a dramatic collapse, but as a methodical retreat conducted by professional soldiers who recognized that their last chance for victory in the West had slipped away. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, stood in the ruins of Sankt Vith and surveyed the aftermath of 6 weeks of brutal winter warfare. The small Belgian town, which had changed hands 3 times during the battle, bore the scars of intense combat, shattered buildings, burned-out vehicles, and hastily dug graves marked with crude wooden crosses. "The Kraut fought well," Bradley remarked to his aide, Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen. "Better than we had any right to expect from an army that's supposed to be beaten." The statistics of the Battle of the Bulge told a story of unprecedented carnage and heroism. American casualties totaled over 9,000 men killed, wounded, and missing, making it the costliest single battle in the United States. Army history. German losses were equally severe, with over 100,000 casualties among their finest remaining divisions, but the numbers alone could not capture the human drama that had unfolded in the snow-covered. Countless individual acts of heroism had turned the tide of battle. Medics who braved enemy fire to treat wounded soldiers, tank crews who fought on despite overwhelming odds, and infantry squads that held impossible positions until reinforcements could arrive. Technical Sergeant Morrison, now commanding what remained of his original company, led his men through the abandoned German positions around Sankt Vith. The enemy had retreated in good order, taking most of their equipment with them, but they had left behind evidence of their desperate situation: empty ammunition boxes, discarded personal equipment, and shallow graves hastily covered with frozen earth among the German dead. Morrison's men found soldiers as young as 16 and as old as 50, evidence of the Reich's growing manpower crisis. These were not the elite SS troops or veteran Panzer Grenadiers who had spearheaded the initial assault, but Volksgrenadier conscripts and hastily trained replacements pressed into service as German losses mounted. Colonel Fuller,
who had survived
the initial German onslaught and fought throughout the 6-week battle, reflected on the transformation he had witnessed in American forces. The Green troops, who had been surprised and scattered on December 16th, had evolved into hardened veterans capable of matching the best the Wehrmacht could offer. The 106th Infantry Division, decimated in the opening days of the offensive, had been rebuilt with survivors and replacements who fought with the skill and determination of elite units, as detailed in the official United States Army history, the Ardennes Battle of the Bulge. The German failure in the Ardennes marked the end of any realistic hope for a negotiated peace in the West and opened the path for the final Allied assault on Germany itself. The strategic consequences of the Battle of the Bulge extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Hitler's decision to commit his last reserves to the Ardennes offensive had fatally weakened German defenses on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were preparing for their final push toward Berlin. The panzer divisions that might have delayed the Russian advance were instead destroyed in the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. More importantly, the battle had demonstrated the resilience of democratic armies when faced with unexpected adversity. American forces, caught completely by surprise and initially overwhelmed, had rallied to defeat Germany's last major offensive in the West. The citizen soldiers of the United States Army had proven themselves capable of matching the professional military tradition of Prussia in the ultimate test of combat. Lieutenant Winters, now a company commander after his original captain had been killed in the fighting around Bastogne, gathered his remaining men for the march back to quarters. Easy Company had entered the battle with 140 men. They were leaving with 67 effective soldiers. The cost had been terrible. They had held when holding mattered most, as the last American units withdrew from the battlefield. Local Belgian and Luxembourg civilians began to emerge from cellars and bomb shelters. They had waited out 6 weeks of warfare. Many had lost their homes, their possessions, and sometimes their loved ones in the fighting. But they greeted the departing American soldiers as liberators who had saved them from a return to Nazi occupation. The Battle of the Bulge was over, but its lessons would echo through military history. It had shown that surprise and initial tactical success were not enough to overcome superior resources, better logistics, and the determination of free men fighting for a just cause. Hitler's last gamble had failed. With it died any hope that the Third Reich might survive the approaching Allied victory. In the spring of 1945, many of the same American units that had fought in the Ardennes would cross the Rhine River and drive deep into the heart of Germany itself. Carrying with them the hard-won experience and unshakable confidence that came from victory in the Battle of the Bulge,